Hello. The purpose of this video is to refresh and explain information around essential reports available to you as part of the Measure of Academic Progress, or MAP, assessment suite. Today, we're going to learn how to access, interpret, and apply report data from 4 different reports in order to identify areas of strength and need to flexibly group students for instruction. We're also going to learn how to drill down to specific standards with the learning continuum and explore ways to talk about MAP growth data with stakeholders. A resource for today can be found at this tinyurl.com/UCSD MAP reports. This contains a PDF of a reports portfolio that you might find helpful after this presentation is over. A little bit of information I wanted to share quickly before we dig into these reports is a quick little statistics review. So we all know that the mean is the average of all scores and that the median is the middle score. A concept that can sometimes be misunderstood is the concept of standard deviation. Standard deviation is really the measure of the variability in scores. So in this graphic, for example, the mean is represented by this vertical line in the middle of the bell curve. One standard deviation represents 34% of individuals, the 34% of individuals who were slightly higher than the mean. This 13.5% of individuals out here would be considered 2 standard deviations away from the mean. 2.35% of individuals are 3 standard deviations away from the mean, and so on. This is based on a typical bell curve, and again shows variability in scores, which will become a little more apparent as we get into a little farther into this video. When you have small standard deviations, such as represented in this graphic on the left side here, your bell curve is a lot skinnier. What this means is you have little variation in your scores. More scores are clustered or closer to the mean score. However, when you have a large standard deviation, or larger, such as shown in this example on the right, that means you've got more variation. Your scores are farther away from that mean point. So small standard deviation has some implications for instruction. If your class has a small standard deviation on a particular assessment, what that means is that their scores are more close together and there's not as great of a need for differentiation. However, if your scores of your students have a large standard deviation, then that means they're more widely scattered and you're more likely to need higher levels of differentiation. Another thing that I just wanted to go over quickly about MAP is that with every assessment, as with MAP, there's a measure of error. Error is mainly caused by students guessing, right or wrong. A guess is not an accurate measure of what students actually know. And when we think about fixed form tests like our old Iowa assessments or our current ISASP, these measurements, these assessments, have a greater error than computer adaptive tests. The reason for that is because kids can guess on a 4-point multiple choice and have a 25% chance of getting that question right just simply by guessing. On a computer adaptive test like MAP, the questions adjust and change depending on the student's previous answer. So if a student gets a question right, the next question might get a little bit harder. If the student gets a question wrong, the next question might get a little bit easier. And the purpose of that is to try to more accurately pinpoint what a student actually knows and is able to do. So think of it this way. If this was a 50-question adaptive test, like in MAP, in this graphic, it shows the student answers question 1 right. That's why there's this little green check mark. So the next question gets a little harder. They answer that one right. So the next question gets a little bit harder. They answer that one wrong. So it gets easier. Wrong again, easier again, then right, and so on and so forth. And you can see by the white band here how the standard error decreases the farther you get down this line. So In MAP, the standard error is generally about plus or minus 2.9 RIT scores, which is one of the lowest, if not the lowest, standard errors on the market in assessments today. All right, so a couple of other things about data. There's 3 different ways to really look at data using MAP. The first one is norm referenced. So there was a norm study that was actually done in 2019-20. This slide says 2015, but the last one was actually just completed. And what that's doing is comparing the students, all the students that took the MAP assessment across the United States over the last several years, and you're able to derive from that a percentile rank. So for example, if you see a student report that says a student is in the 75th percentile, then that means they did better than 75% of students taking that same exam, based on those 10 million or so students from the norm study. The self-referenced is really just a way to measure growth, and that compares a student's score to his or her previous score to determine how much growth was made, and we'll show you how to look at that in the reports. And then standards referenced is a way to compare a student's score to academic standards to determine what the student knows and is ready to learn, and there's a way to look at that information in MAP as well. So MAP is measured in something called RIT, and RIT stands for a Rausch unit. Rausch was a psychologist, a psychometrician, I believe, that this particular unit was named after. But basically, it's a continuum, and the difficulty and complexity of each MAP test item that a student gets is measured using that RIT scale. When you see a RIT scale for a student, that indicates the level at which they're answering questions correctly 50% of the time. So again, when they get one right, it gets a little bit harder. When they get one wrong, it gets a little bit easier. But over the course of that entire exam, the RIT indicates where they scored correctly about 50% of the time. So that RIT then corresponds to the content and skills that a student should be working on or is ready to be working on in a class, and that's referred to as their instructional level, which is why MAP is not an achievement test. It's a test designed to measure where kids are ready to learn, not where they are achieving, quote unquote. And that's really different than what we're used to. We're used to tests that measure students on achievement level, and this is really talking about instructional level, what they're ready to learn. The RIT scale is like a ruler. It's an equal interval scale. So going from 175 to 180 is the same amount of growth as going from 215 to 220, which is nice because that allows us to measure a student's growth over time and not looking at just isolated test events. And RIT scores are also grade level independent. So a 3rd grader and an 8th grader, if they both have a RIT of 210, they're at the same instructional level. So just to give a little bit of context about RIT scores. So to log into NWEA, go to www.nwea.org. What we're going to do is view reports, which is located on the left side of the screen once you log in. Students have to be rostered to you in PowerSchool in order for you to see their data in MAP, and this automatic rostering takes place approximately once every evening. It does take a couple of days from the time a student is enrolled in PowerSchool to the time that they show up on your MAP roster. So it may take a couple of days, again, if students are moving in throughout the year. Unfortunately, only the primary teacher and a co-teaching pair can see the data. So in a co-teaching situation, you would want to make sure that you're sharing these reports with your co-teacher. The RIT score can be seen in EduClimber by all teachers who have access to a particular student. So the first report we're going to take a look at is this class report, and here are some questions that you can answer using the class report. This is the icon, and if you click on that icon, you would be able to pull up the class report. So we're really going to be looking for the mean and median in terms of the RIT score, and we're also going to look at the standard deviation, and we're going to say, does this indicate a high amount of variation or a low amount of variation? So right here, what you're looking at is a summary of a class report, and this is a sample from the MAP reports portfolio. So this is looking right up here at 11 students, so students with valid growth test scores. The mean of this class was 201.4 RIT points, the median was 201, and the standard deviation was 11.2. In general, anything really above 8 or a 9 is going to be a pretty high standard deviation that indicates quite a bit of variability in the class. So this class has a pretty high level of variability, and therefore would need some differentiation. The district grade level mean is represented here at 201. That district grade level mean will not show up until the testing window has been closed, but then you'd be able to see that after the testing window is closed. So if you test early on in the testing window, you're not going to have this information in your class report until after that window has closed. There are 6 students out of the 11 that are above the mean, and 4 that are at or above the norm grade level mean. So this is the norm grade level mean for this particular this particular grade level based on those national norms. So you can see based on this, the district grade level mean is actually below the national norm in this case. District was 201, norm 205.7. Below here, you can look at different areas of the MAP test. This is showing the reading test, and the reading test is broken up into literature, informational text, and vocabulary acquisition and use. These colored bars below each section represent the proportion of students that are in each of these bands. So the lowest is students that are less than the 21st percentile, 21st to 40th, average is 41st to 60th, high average 61st to 80th, and high would be greater than 80th. And again, that's based on just your standard bell curve. All right, so on page 2 of the reports portfolio that was included in the document earlier, you can see that you can answer what are the instructional areas, in what instructional area was the class mean the highest, in what instructional area did the class have the highest amount of variation, and what percent of students in this class scored in the average band. And I'm going to show you the answers to all of these questions on the next screen. So when we look at, this is a sample, again, a sample, this is not real student data. This is from the MAP growth portfolio document that is linked in at the beginning of this presentation. So this shows on the left all of the different students. This particular report is organized lowest to highest. So this student right here had the lowest RIT score. That's 181. That's his RIT score. But because of error, it could actually be as high as 184 or as low as 178. That goes back to that standard error that we were talking about earlier. This student's percentile rank is the 5th percentile, could be as high as 8th, could be as low as 4th, again, based on standard error. Lexile range is a measure of a big range, if you will, but it's a measure of how to tell if students are ready to read a particular book. This is a really large range, and so this really should not be used to determine whether or not a student is reading on grade level or not, because it is such a huge range. Down here, this shows this Lexile number refers to where students are more independent, so 158. But up to 308, that's where this student is instructional, meaning with support, they could access this text. This test took 75 minutes for this particular student, and this shows areas of relative strength or weakness. So for example, letter A refers to the literature. That is this student's relative weakness. Their RIT range was 163 to 177. Their relative strength is vocabulary acquisition and use, which was referred to over here. 187 to 197 is their RIT range. And notice that they're bolded, the relative strengths. If a student doesn't have a relative strength, like this particular student here, Ambrose, there's no bolded sets of numbers, because really he or she performed in the same band for all those different sub areas of the reading test. So the next report we're going to take a look at is this class breakdown. This is what the icon looks like, and if you select to view this report by goal and review the report online, it's highly interactive. The advantage of this report is it shows you the spread of your students, the breakdown of your students in a particular class. If you're an elementary teacher, you can view this for your entire class. If you're a secondary teacher, you'll have to view this for each period that you teach. When you click on that icon on the previous screen, you get different fields that you can select. If you make sure you always select the current term for term rostered, so this year that would be fall 2020, 2021. You can look at how they performed in the winter, the students that you have in class now. You can look at how they performed last winter before the school year even starts by selecting winter 2019-20. So you can look back at results from previous years. You fill in your filters, make sure that right down here you select by goal and view the report online. When you view the report online, you get an interactive report. So anywhere you see blue is able to be drilled down into. So what I'm looking at right now is a 5th grade math assessment. The math assessment is broken down into these 4 areas on the left. Up here at the top are the RIT bands. So this class has some students that are in the 241 to 250 RIT range. Those students are here. And some students, a student that's in the 161 to 170. So there's quite a spread. The more names that are in a box, the more students that are performing in that particular band. So you can see that this class overall, if you look at these 4 RIT bands, has a nice cluster of kids that are performing between this 201 and 240. That's still a decent spread, but you can see a nice cluster here. You've got a few outliers, these students over here who are performing higher than their peers, and you've definitely got some students over here that are performing lower than their peers in each of those different areas. By clicking on the student, you can drill down into specific standards that they're ready to learn. So this class report is a nice overview, or class breakdown by goal is a nice overview to show you the variation in your class in terms of how they are performing. You can answer some questions like these. How many of those 10-point RIT bands does the class span? In what instructional areas do students have the widest variation? And that would be by looking at those rows on the left. And then how might you use this information to inform planning for instruction or even your instructional grouping of students by looking at those areas? The third report really goes hand in hand with the previous one, and this is called the Learning Continuum. On pages 6 to 7, you can see a sample of the Learning Continuum. Again, that's in the resource that was linked into that tiny URL at the beginning of this video. But I'm also going to show you some screenshots so you can see what it looks like. The Learning Continuum is incredibly helpful because it shows specific skills or standards that students are ready to learn based on their MAP results. The Learning Continuum icon looks like this when you're on your reports page. When you click on it, and I'm going to reiterate this in a minute with a screenshot, you definitely want to make sure you edit your display options to group things by standard because that's how our curriculum documents are organized. You can also select the grade level you teach to narrow down the number of standards that you're seeing. So for example, when I click on that icon, I get some fields that I will need to fill in. Up here on the left, you would want to make sure that you select term rostered as fall 2020-2021. Term rostered always refers to when the students are in your class if you'd like to see your current students. Term tested would refer to the last time they took this assessment. So if you're looking to this prior to the beginning of the school year, then winter 2019-20 would be the term tested. So term rostered refers, again, to students who are in your class right now, so fall 2020-2021. Term tested would be the last time they took the test. Currently, when I'm making this video, fall 2020-21 is not yet an option, so I apologize for this misleading view. You would select your school, the instructor, the class. Remember, for elementary teachers, all of the options are the same class. For secondary teachers, these would be organized by periods that you teach, and then you would select which particular test you'd want to look at. This screen shows you that you want to edit the display options. You definitely want to click Group by Standard, and again, to minimize the number of outliers and standards that you're seeing, you can select just your grade level. You could select a grade below and a grade above. It's really up to you. But to narrow it down a little bit in the beginning, you might want to just select your grade level and 1 or 2 on either side of it. What you get then is a report that's organized by standards. And what you're looking at here is the RIT range of 201 to 210 in operations and algebraic thinking. So these are the two 5th grade standards that fall in this RIT range. Over here, what's been blacked out or whited out here are the names of individual students that fall into this RIT range. So these 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 students are ready for these standards. A great way to use this report would be when you are planning your upcoming units, start with the standards that you teach. Then go back into a report such as this and find out which of the students are ready to learn those standards. Are there students that perhaps are missing some of the prerequisite knowledge? So for example, in this one, you're looking at uses parentheses, brackets, and braces in numerical expressions. You can see what these students are ready to do compared to what these students are ready to do. These students up here might still need some additional support with whole numbers and parentheses that these students down here maybe don't need. Or excuse me, addition and subtraction with whole numbers and parentheses that these students don't need. So really start with the units first, then dive into what this report might tell you about prerequisite skills students might need for that instruction. All right, the final report we're going to talk about today is the student profile report. This is shown on page 18 to 19 of that reports portfolio linked earlier in this video. And this really shows detailed information regarding student achievement and growth. So in a report, an individual student report, a couple of things that I'm just going to highlight very quickly. So you can toggle back and forth between the different tests by clicking on these areas up here. Right now, because this one's a little bit bigger, I'm looking at reading. This tells me that this student's standard error was plus or minus 3 RIT points. So her RIT was 218, but that could be as high as 221, could be as low as 214.6, which that's the information you get there. Took the student 52 minutes. She did not have any % of disengaged responses. In other words, there were no times when she was just quickly clicking through questions and not paying attention. Over here on the left, it tells you the growth and achievement. So growth, this student was growing at the 62nd percentile or better than 62% of students in the norm study that took this test at this age. And the achievement was at the 69th percentile. This quadrant chart, which I'm going to show you in a minute, shows that this student would be in the high growth, high achievement quadrant, which is where we want our students to be. This breaks down the 3 different areas of the reading test that we're looking at into the 3 subtests. So you can see this student has a strength in vocabulary acquisition and usage, and the area for growth is definitely an informational text because that is the lowest RIT band or RIT score. This is a graphical representation of the student's performance on MAP. And you'll see it does go up and down a little bit because this is such a highly responsive test and because it's impossible to assess the full range of all the standards in a particular subject area. You're going to see a little bit of bouncing around on this. Nothing drastic, a little bit up, a little bit down. And you can see based on these colors what percentile ranking this student falls in. So started in sort of that high average, the 61st to 80th, dipped down here into just, average and back up into high average. So you can that's one way to conceptualize what this information means. If you'd like to click this little button on the right, a linking study has been done between the MAP assessment and the ACT. And so this shows that this student is on track to meet the college readiness benchmarks. There's this slightly small light or darker gray band right here. This represents a ACT score of 22 or higher, and the very dark gray band represents an ACT score of 24 or higher. Anything in the light gray means that they're not on track to meet the college readiness benchmarks in the ACT. So MAP is aligned to the standards that we teach in literacy, math, and science, which is super helpful. The primary purpose of MAP is to help us understand what kids are ready to learn so we can improve how we teach them. And in particular, with the extended gap in our school time due to the COVID crisis, the information and the ability to dig deeply into the standards that students may not have prerequisite knowledge around and may need some additional support in is going to be really, really, really helpful. It's normal for student scores to fluctuate, and the more test events a student has, the more certain that we can be that their growth trend is accurate. So as you consider using MAP information this fall, these 4 reports might be one place to start to help differentiate learning for kids and make up for lost instructional time. Thank you.